Hey guys, tonight we are going to gently amble through the often bewildering, sometimes stinky, and occasionally hilarious world of medieval town laws. Imagine yourself, if you will, not just learning about it, but actually there, trying to navigate a day without getting fined for your goose honking too loudly or for accidentally wearing the wrong kind of pointy shoes. You can practically smell the wood smoke, the damp wool, and, well, other less romantic medieval aromas already, can't you? It's a world where common sense often took a holiday, and bylaws sprung up like mushrooms after a rain shower. Honestly, given the general lack of, shall we say, modern sanitation and understanding of basic hygiene, you'd probably last about as long as a smartphone battery in a snowstorm if you actually woke up there. But from the safe, cozy distance of your bed, it's all rather quaint. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there? It's always fascinating to see where these sleepy stories end up. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The road, and I use that term loosely, it's more of a suggestion with potholes and the occasional suspiciously large puddle, is starting to get busier. You've been walking for what feels like an age, the sun slowly arcing across the sky, and now, finally, the landscape is changing. Fewer open fields, more small, tilled plots of land, the occasional wattle and daub cottage puffing smoke from a low chimney. And then you see it, rising from the gentle swell of the land ahead. The town. Not a city, not yet, but a proper bona fide town. Its presence announced by a sturdy-looking, if somewhat patched, stone wall. Above the wall, you can just glimpse the higgledy-piggledy rooftops, a spire or two, and the promise of, well, something different from the quiet countryside. This isn't just any random collection of huts, you remind yourself. This town, let's call it Oakhaven for our journey, likely holds a charter. That's a very important piece of parchment, probably covered in elaborate script and sealed with an impressively large wax seal from some important lord, or maybe even the king himself. This charter is its badge of honor, its declaration of a certain degree of independence. Many medieval towns, especially from the 11th century onwards, began to acquire these charters, which granted them specific rights and privileges. They could often elect their own mayor and council, collect their own local taxes, much to the delight of everyone, I'm sure, and, crucially for our sleepy exploration, create and enforce their own local laws, their bylaws. It's like their medieval version of a terms and conditions agreement, except with more wax seals and fewer pop-up ads. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for towns seeking charters was economic aspiration, a desire to control their own booming trade and markets, or a more fundamental yearning for greater legal independence from the often unpredictable whims of feudal lords. Perhaps, as with most things, it was a bit of both. As you draw closer, the sounds become more distinct. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of cartwheels on uneven ground, a chorus of animal noises that would make a modern petting zoo blush, and the general hum of human activity. The main gate, a heavy wooden affair set into a rather grand stone gatehouse, looks both imposing and a little bit tired, like an old bulldog. It's probably seen a fair few scuffles and a lot of comings and goings. Some towns took immense pride in their gates and walls, not just for defense, but as a statement of their status and wealth. You might find intricate carvings or even the town's coat of arms proudly displayed. It's a quirky tidbit that some town seals, which were used to authenticate official documents including these new laws, depicted surprisingly mundane local items they were proud of. Maybe Oakhaven's features a particularly plump acorn or an exceptionally well-coopered barrel. It's their brand identity, medieval style. You notice that the flow of people heading towards the gate is a mixed bag. Farmers with laden donkeys, merchants with pack horses, a couple of monks in their simple robes, and even a rather flamboyant character on a horse who might be a minor noble or just someone with a very good opinion of their tailor. Each one of them, once they pass through that gate, will be subject to Oakhaven's particular set of rules. Ignorance of the law, even for a weary traveler like yourself, probably won't be much of an excuse if your pig, should you happen to have one, decides to dig up the mayor's prize-winning turnips. The very concept of a town having its own distinct legal framework, separate from the overarching feudal or royal law, was a significant development in the medieval period. It signified a shift, a slow crawl towards more localized governance and, for the inhabitants, a different kind of social contract. You're not just a serf on a manor anymore. You're a townsperson, a burgher, with both new freedoms and a whole new list of things you're not allowed to do. And oh, what a list it promises to be. The air is thick with anticipation, and maybe a hint of manure, as you prepare to step across the threshold into the regulated world of Oakhaven. You take that step, crossing the threshold under the arch of the main gate, and the sounds of Oakhaven wash over you in a wave. It's a chaotic symphony of life. Merchants hawking their wares with surprising lung power, children shrieking as they chase a stray chicken, the rhythmic thud of some unseen craftsman's mallet, and the ever-present chatter of 100 conversations blending into a low roar. The air, as anticipated, is a rich tapestry of scents, baking bread from a nearby stall, the sweet smell of hay, the tang of sawdust, and yes, that ever-reliable medieval background note of well-unmanaged waste. You navigate through the throng, your feet finding purchase on the cobblestones that are surprisingly uneven, clearly laid down with more enthusiasm than precision. Buildings lean companionably towards each other over the narrow street, their upper stories jutting out, almost seeming to gossip across the way. There's a lot to take in. As the afternoon begins to wane, a subtle shift occurs in the town's rhythm. The frantic energy of midday commerce starts to ebb, replaced by a more purposeful bustle. Shopkeepers begin to pack away some of their more valuable goods, and you notice families herding their children, and occasionally their livestock indoors. Then, a sound begins to penetrate the general hubbub, a deep, resonant clang. It's the curfew bell, likely rung from the main church tower or a dedicated bell tower near the town hall. The term curfew, as you might recall from some dusty corner of your mind, comes from the Old French couvre-feu, which literally means cover fire. This was a pretty mainstream and sensible precaution in towns built largely of wood and thatch, where an untended hearth could easily lead to a catastrophic blaze that could engulf entire neighborhoods in the blink of an eye. So, when that bell tolls, it's a signal for households to bank their fires for the night, to reduce the risk of accidental ignition while everyone is asleep. A very practical, if somewhat peremptory, way to ensure the town doesn't go up in smoke like a badly planned bonfire. Soon after the bell's first tolls, you spot him, a figure of authority, or at least someone dressed like it. This is likely a member of the town watch. He's not exactly a knight in shining armor, more like a sturdy fellow in a leather jerkin, carrying a stout staff and a horn, perhaps a dimly glowing lantern now that the shadows are lengthening. He looks like he's seen one too many late-night brawls over who has the pointiest shoes, and his expression is one of weary diligence. The town watch was, in essence, the medieval equivalent of a neighborhood patrol, though their effectiveness and level of professionalism varied wildly from town to town and, indeed, from watchman to watchman. Their main job was to be a deterrent, to patrol the streets after curfew, to ensure gates were locked, and occasionally, to trip over a sleeping pig that had also missed the memo about being indoors. They were there to investigate suspicious noises, apprehend troublemakers, and generally try to keep a lid on things until morning. The watchman gives a pointed look at a few lingering merchants who seem to be taking their sweet time packing up. The curfew wasn't just about fire safety. It was also about public order. Medieval nights were dark, pitch dark, in fact, unless there was a full moon. Street lighting, as we know it, was non-existent. This made the streets ideal for any ne'er-do-wells, from petty thieves to more serious ruffians. Limiting movement after a certain hour was a way to reduce crime, or at least make it harder for criminals to operate unseen. And also, frankly, because nothing good ever happens after midnight, especially when street lighting consists of hope for a full moon. So, once that curfew bell has well and truly sounded, the town gates, like the one you just entered, would be firmly shut and barred for the night. If you were a traveler arriving late, you'd likely be spending the night outside the walls, hoping the local wolves weren't feeling peckish. It's a quirky tidbit that in some towns, watchmen had specific, sometimes rather mournful, cries or even short songs they would intone as they made their rounds. It wasn't just to prove they were awake and on duty, though that was part of it, but also to announce the hour and sometimes even the weather conditions. 10 o'clock and all's well, and a frost is settling in. You can almost hear it, a lonely voice cutting through the silent, darkened streets. A sort of medieval talking clock and AccuWeather service rolled into one, delivered with all the melodic grace of a man who'd rather be warm in bed. The level of strictness in enforcing these curfews is something historians still debate. It's plausible that the rules were applied more stringently to the common folk, while the wealthy or well-connected might have had ways to navigate the nighttime streets with a well-placed coin or a nod from a friendly watchman. The watch itself wasn't always a popular institution. They were sometimes seen as meddlers, and there are accounts of watchmen being mocked, or even assaulted, by resentful townsfolk who felt their nocturnal freedoms were being unfairly curtailed. But for tonight, as the last echoes of the curfew bell fade and the heavy clang of the town gate being secured rumbles through the air, a sense of enforced quiet begins to descend upon Oakhaven. The day is done officially. With the new dawn, or at least what passes for it through the narrow gap between the overhanging buildings outside your window, Oakhaven stirs back to life. The enforced quiet of the curfew gradually gives way to the familiar sounds of a town waking up, a rooster crowing with surprising enthusiasm from someone's backyard, the rumble of a cart, the distant shouts of early risers. If it's a designated market day, and many towns had at least one or two a week, then the energy levels ramp up considerably faster. You decide to venture out, drawn by the increasing hum of activity that suggests the main square is transforming into a bustling hub of commerce. And indeed, as you approach, the space is a riot of color, sound, and smell. Temporary stalls, constructed from timber frames and canvas awnings, are rapidly appearing. Merchants are laying out their wares with practiced hands. Bolts of rough woolen cloth next to finer, dyed linens. Leather goods from belts to waterskins. Pots and pans of clay and metal, and an astonishing array of foodstuffs. You can see everything from slightly suspicious-looking sausages to surprisingly sturdy-looking shoes. Presumably not the pointy ones that caused brawls, as our watchman friend from last night might attest. This, the marketplace, is the lifeblood of Oakhaven, and like any vital organ, it needs careful regulation to function smoothly and, above all, fairly. Medieval town authorities were acutely aware that a reputation for dishonest trading could kill a market, and by extension, the town's prosperity. So, a whole raft of laws and ordinances were typically in place to govern market conduct. Perhaps the most well-known of these, certainly in English towns, was the assize of bread and ale. This was a crucial piece of legislation, dating back to the 13th century, designed to regulate the price, weight, and quality of these two absolute staples of the medieval diet. It was the medieval version of a food standards agency, only with more public humiliation and fewer lengthy reports. The price of a loaf of bread, for instance, wasn't just plucked out of thin air by the baker. It was often set by the authorities in relation to the current price of grain. And that loaf had to be the correct weight. Bakers usually made a batch, and then one or two loaves, the test loaves, would be weighed by a market official. If they were found to be consistently underweight, the baker was in for a rather unpleasant time. Punishments for dishonest bakers or brewers, or brewsters, as female brewers were often called, and brewing was a trade with significant female participation, could be quite severe and very public. You might be fined heavily, a painful blow to your livelihood, or, for repeated offenses or particularly egregious cheating, you could find yourself in the stocks or the pillory, often with your substandard, underweight loaf or a pitcher of your watery, sour ale hung around your neck for all your neighbors and customers to see, and no doubt comment upon. Imagine the shame and the distinct lack of repeat business. If your loaf of bread felt more like a paving stone, or your ale tasted like it had been strained through an old sock, you actually had some recourse, which is more than you can say for some modern customer service lines. These laws weren't just about punishing the deceitful. They were about ensuring that even the poorest members of the community could get a fair measure of basic sustenance for their hard-earned pennies. Beyond bread and ale, other goods were also subject to scrutiny. Weights and measures were a constant concern. Each town was supposed to have a set of official weights and measures, often kept securely in the town hall or guild hall, against which merchants' own equipment could be checked. You might see an official, an ale conner for tasting ale, or a weigher and measurer, solemnly making their rounds, their presence a reminder to all sellers to keep things honest. Some towns got quite specific with their market rules. It's a quirky tidbit that you might find regulations dictating exactly where certain types of goods could be sold within the marketplace. Fishmongers, for very obvious olfactory reasons, were often confined to a specific downwind corner, while sellers of live animals had their own designated pens. Sometimes rules dictated who could sell what and when. Perhaps only local women were permitted to sell butter and cheese on Fridays, or visiting merchants from another town could only sell their goods wholesale to local shopkeepers, not directly to the public, in an effort to protect local businesses. Historians still debate how consistently these market regulations, like the assize of bread and ale, were actually enforced across different towns and regions, and whether the punishments served more as a deterrent or as a regular source of income from fines for often cash-strapped town officials. Were they truly upholding justice, or just topping up the municipal coffers? Probably a bit of column A, a bit of column B. The market cross, often an ornate stone structure in the center of the square, stood as a symbol not just of the town's Christian faith, but also of its commitment to fair dealing, a place where oaths might be sworn and public pronouncements made, all under the watchful eyes of the community and, theoretically, a higher power. It's a complex, vibrant, and carefully policed ecosystem, this medieval market, and as you wander through it, you're walking through a living testament to the medieval mind's attempt to impose order on the inherent chaos of commerce. As you meander away from the most crowded part of the Oakhaven market, the symphony of human commerce begins to intermingle more noticeably with a rather insistent chorus of animal sounds. It's not just the occasional bleating sheep destined for someone's table or the clucking of chickens in wicker cages. No, this is the sound of animals that consider the town streets their own personal playground and pantry. And topping the charts of these wandering menaces, at least in terms of sheer audibility and attitude, are, of course, the geese. But we'll get to those feathered overlords in a moment. First, let's address the pigs. Pigs, bless their muddy hearts, were the medieval equivalent of a four-legged, self-propelled garbage disposal unit, only with a far less discerning palate and a tendency to leave deposits that weren't exactly biodegradable in a hurry. In many medieval towns, it was quite common for households to keep a pig or two. They were a valuable source of meat, fat, and even bristles, and they were remarkably good at finding their own food amongst the refuse that, as we've established, wasn't always diligently collected. The problem was, their foraging habits often involved enthusiastic digging. A pig could make short work of a carefully tended vegetable patch, root up the paving of a street, such as it was, and generally create muddy, unsanitary wallows wherever it pleased. This, understandably, led to a plethora of town bylaws. Many towns mandated that if you owned a pig, it had to be kept securely penned in your own yard. If it was allowed out, it often had to be rung. That is, have a metal ring inserted into its snout to prevent it from digging. You can imagine how popular that procedure was with the pig. Failure to comply would, naturally, result in a fine, and if your errant swine was a repeat offender, it might even be confiscated by the town authorities and, well, probably end up contributing to the town council's dinner. It was a constant battle between the economic necessity of pig keeping and the desire for some semblance of order and cleanliness on the streets. Then there were the dogs. Unlike today, where dogs are often cherished members of the family, medieval town dogs were a much more varied bunch. Some were working animals, guard dogs, hunting hounds, dogs used for turning spits. But many were simply strays, or loosely owned creatures that roamed freely, scavenging for scraps, forming noisy packs, and occasionally biting unsuspecting ankles. Laws often tried to control their numbers or hold owners responsible for their dogs' misdeeds. You might find regulations about muzzling particularly aggressive dogs, or even outright bans on keeping large mastiffs within the town walls, lest they be used for nefarious purposes or simply prove too dangerous in crowded areas. There was often a particular concern about dogs in churches, leading to the quirky appointment in some parishes of a dog whipper, an official whose rather specific job it was to ensure that canine congregants were promptly ejected, lest their barking or other contributions disrupt the sermon. And now, the stars of our show, the geese. Oh, the geese. If you thought a barking dog was disruptive, you've clearly never lived next door to a medieval gaggle. Geese are loud, impressively, unashamedly loud, and they are seemingly convinced that the entire town needs to be alerted to every falling leaf, passing cart, or particularly suspicious-looking cloud. Their volume control was permanently stuck on 11. Like pigs, They were a common sight, providing meat, eggs, and valuable feathers for quills and fletching arrows. But they also had a penchant for wandering, for grazing where they weren't wanted, and for leaving their slimy green calling cards everywhere. Laws specifically targeting geese were therefore quite common. You might be fined if your geese were found fouling the public well, or if they strayed into the market and started helping themselves to the grain merchant's sacks. There were often detailed rules about how many geese you could keep, and where they were permitted to roam, or, more accurately, where they were not permitted. Historians still debate whether the primary motivation for these animal control laws was public sanitation and hygiene, the protection of property and orderly streets, or simply an attempt to reduce the general annoyance and noise levels in densely populated areas. Given the sheer cacophony a flock of agitated geese can produce, I'm leaning towards the latter being a very strong contender. Trying to enforce these animal bylaws must have been like playing a never-ending game of whack-a-mole, except the moles are surprisingly fast pigs and geese with attitude. Imagine being the town official, perhaps a beadle or a lower-ranking constable, tasked with rounding up an unlicensed sow or lecturing Mistress Agnes yet again about her flock of honking intruders terrorizing the baker's boy. It would require the patience of a saint and probably a very long stick. Yet, these laws persisted and were constantly being reiterated and amended, which suggests two things. One, that animals running amok were a genuine and persistent problem, and two, that the townsfolk, despite their love for fresh pork and goose dinners, also craved a little peace and order amidst the medieval melee. The soundtrack of Oakhaven, it seems, was one part human industry, one part animal chaos, and one part exasperated bylaw enforcement. Leaving the particular chaos of Oakhaven's free-roaming animal population somewhat in your wake, though the occasional honk or squeal still punctuates the air, you find your attention drawn towards streets where the sounds of human endeavor are more refined, more focused. Here, the clang of metal is more rhythmic, the sawing of wood more purposeful, the whir of a loom more hypnotic. You're entering the domain of the craftsmen, the skilled artisans who are the backbone of the town's manufacturing economy. And where there are craftsmen in a medieval town, there are almost certainly guilds. These weren't just social clubs. Guilds were powerful, highly organized associations of masters, journeymen, and apprentices within a specific trade, and they wielded considerable influence, effectively creating their own layer of law and order within the broader town regulations. Imagine stepping into the workshop of a master weaver. The air is thick with the scent of wool and lanolin, and the rhythmic clatter of the loom is the dominant sound. This master didn't just wake up one day and decide to start weaving. Oh no, becoming a master craftsman was a long haul, often involving a 7-year apprenticeship, starting as a young boy. During this time, the apprentice lived with the master, learning every facet of the trade, from preparing the raw materials to the most intricate techniques, and probably how to make his master's tea exactly right, a skill not to be underestimated in any era. After completing his apprenticeship, he'd become a journeyman, literally a day worker, free to hire out his skills, perhaps even traveling to other towns to gain more experience, to become a master himself, and thus eligible to join the guild as a full voting member and open his own shop. A journeyman typically had to produce a masterpiece, a piece of work that demonstrated his consummate skill and met the exacting standards of the guild. And those standards were indeed exacting. The guilds were, in many ways, the medieval guarantors of quality control. Each guild, whether for weavers, cobblers, bakers, masons, goldsmiths, or any other recognized craft, had its own meticulously detailed rulebook, its own set of internal laws. These guild rulebooks could be incredibly detailed, specifying everything from the correct type of wood for a chair leg, to the precise number of threads per inch in a piece of high-quality cloth, to the exact alloy of metal to be used in a pewter tankard. It was like IKEA assembly instructions, but with actual consequences if you messed up, and usually enforced by stern-faced older gentlemen who had seen it all. Guild officials, often called wardens or searchers, had the authority to inspect workshops, examine goods, and confiscate any products that didn't meet the required standards. This wasn't just about protecting the consumer, it was about protecting the reputation of the guild and, by extension, all its members. If Oakhaven's weavers got a reputation for shoddy work, it would harm everyone in that trade. This obsession with quality also extended to who was allowed to practice the craft. Guilds operated as effective monopolies. Trying to set up shop as a shoemaker within Oakhaven's walls without being a member of the Shoemakers Guild was like trying to stream your own medieval history channel without an internet connection, theoretically possible, but practically a recipe for being quietly encouraged to find another town, or facing fines, confiscation of your tools, and general unpleasantness. This restriction of competition is one aspect where historians still debate the true nature of guilds. Was their primary function to protect consumers by ensuring high-quality goods and fair, stable prices, or was it more about protecting the economic interests of their existing members by limiting new entrants and sometimes even stifling innovation that might upset the established order? The answer, most likely, is a complex blend of both. They provided stability and a certain assurance of quality, but they could also be resistant to new methods or ideas that threatened the traditional ways of doing things. Beyond the economic and regulatory aspects, guilds also played a significant social and even religious role in the lives of their members. They often had their own patron saint, Saint Crispin for cobblers, for example, and would organize religious observances, feasts, and processions on their saint's day. Some guilds maintained their own chapels or altars in the town church. It's a quirky tidbit that initiation ceremonies for new masters, or even annual guild feasts, could be quite elaborate affairs, sometimes involving symbolic rituals, secret oaths or handshakes, and a great deal of ceremonial drinking from a communal guild cup. They also acted as a form of social security. Guilds would often provide financial assistance to members who fell ill or into poverty, support the widows and orphans of deceased members, and ensure a proper burial. They were tight-knit communities, a brotherhood, and sometimes, though less commonly sisterhood, within the larger urban community, creating a web of obligations, protections, and very specific laws that governed a huge slice of medieval town life. As you pass by these workshops, you're seeing not just individual craftsmen, but nodes in a powerful and deeply ingrained system of medieval order. Leaving the relatively ordered sounds of the guild workshops, where the rhythm of production at least has a certain purposeful cadence, your ears soon begin to pick up on other, less industrious human noises that Oakhaven's authorities also had very definite opinions on. It seems that controlling the honking of geese and the rooting of pigs, as we explored earlier, was only half the battle for a medieval town council aiming for some semblance of urban tranquility. Humans, it turns out, can be just as disruptive, if not more so, especially when gathered in groups with a bit of ale in them. And so, a whole category of bylaws was dedicated to curbing excessive human-generated noise, effectively creating ordinances for the sounds of silence, or at least the sounds of significantly less racket. One of the prime culprits for noise pollution, then as now, was the local tavern. Taverns, alehouses, and inns, bless their sticky floors and dubious hygiene, were the epicenters of medieval social life for many. They were places to meet, to gossip, to make deals, and, of course, to drink. And where there's drinking, there's often a corresponding rise in volume. Boisterous singing, loud arguments, drunken shouts, and the general cacophony of unrestrained revelry could easily spill out from the tavern doors and disturb the peace of the entire neighborhood, especially in tightly packed urban environments. Town regulations frequently targeted these establishments, often requiring them to close at a certain hour, usually coinciding with or shortly after the curfew bell we heard about earlier. There might be specific fines for tavern keepers who allowed excessive rowdiness or served patrons who were already clearly inebriated and contributing more than their fair share to the local decibel level. It seems the concept of an inside voice was often left at the door along with any lingering sobriety. Then you had your minstrels and musicians. While some skilled troubadours or officially sanctioned town musicians might have been welcomed, the medieval equivalent of a wandering bard with a lute and a repertoire of questionable ballads could be another source of auditory grievance. Imagine trying to get some sleep while someone outside your window attempts a heartfelt, if somewhat off-key, serenade. Some towns had rules about where and when minstrels could perform, sometimes requiring them to have a license or permission from the authorities. This wasn't necessarily about artistic censorship, but more about preventing public nuisance. Then you had your freelance minstrels, some of whom were genuinely talented, and others who sounded like they were strangling a cat with a lute string. The town council probably had a three-bum notes and you're out policy, or at least wished they did. Unregulated musical performances, especially if they drew a crowd or went on too late, could easily fall foul of noise ordinances. It wasn't just organized entertainment that drew the ire of lawmakers. Everyday human interactions, if they got too loud, could also lead to trouble. Shouting in the streets, protracted and audible domestic arguments that disturbed the neighbors, or even overly boisterous children playing unsupervised in a way that caused a persistent disturbance. All these could be subject to local bylaws. People in medieval towns, much like people today stuck in an apartment with a neighbor learning the bagpipes, just wanted a bit of peace and quiet now and then, especially when trying to sleep off a long day of, well, whatever medieval folks did that was tiring, like avoiding wayward pigs or arguing with a guild master. There were also often restrictions on when certain noisy trades could operate. A blacksmith, for example, with all the hammering and banging inherent in his craft, might be prohibited from working before sunrise or after sunset, or on Sundays and holy days, to avoid disturbing his neighbors during their designated times of rest or worship. It's a quirky tidbit that some town records show surprisingly specific prohibitions against particular kinds of noisy behavior that might seem almost comically particular to us today. You might find bylaws against eavesdropping and chattering loudly under people's windows at night, presumably to stop gossipmongers from both hearing and spreading secrets too vociferously. Or there could be fines for inopportune serenading if the object of the affection, or their father, wasn't particularly appreciative of the musical tribute at 3 in the morning. Historians still debate whether these noise ordinances were primarily aimed at maintaining public order and preventing disputes from escalating. A loud argument could easily turn into a physical brawl, or if they reflected a growing urban desire for a more civilized and less chaotic environment, especially among the emerging merchant and artisan classes who valued predictability and a peaceful domestic life. Perhaps it was simply a collective understanding that in such close quarters, a certain level of auditory consideration was necessary to keep the whole fragile urban experiment from collapsing into a state of perpetual, deafening annoyance. The pursuit of quiet, it seems, is not just a modern preoccupation. Having considered how Oakhaven attempts to regulate what its citizens hear, from the clang of the curfew bell to the honk of an unlicensed goose, you now find your attention shifting to how it tried to control what they see, and, more importantly, how they presented themselves and behaved in the public sphere. It wasn't enough for the town to be merely quiet. It also had to appear orderly and respectable, with everyone knowing and, crucially, showing their proper place in the social hierarchy. This desire for visible order manifested most clearly in a fascinating and often bewildering set of regulations known as sumptuary laws. These were laws designed to govern consumption, particularly of clothing and other luxury items, based explicitly on your social rank and wealth. Imagine being told you couldn't wear that rather fetching shade of purple because you weren't a duke, or that your shoe points were exceeding the legal limit for an aspiring merchant. It's like the medieval fashion police were out in full force, armed with rulers and a very judgmental attitude. The main idea behind sumptuary laws, which were enacted across medieval Europe by both church and state, was to reinforce the existing social structure. If a wealthy merchant started dressing like a nobleman, or a peasant woman adorned herself with fabrics and trimmings deemed above her station, it could blur the visual distinctions that kept everyone neatly categorized. This made some people in power rather uncomfortable. So, these laws would meticulously dictate who could wear what. Certain expensive fabrics like silk, velvet, or fine furs like ermine might be reserved exclusively for the nobility or the very wealthiest echelons of society. Specific colors, too, particularly vibrant dyes like scarlet or deep purple, which was historically associated with royalty due to the expense of the dye, were often restricted. Even the style and amount of ornamentation on clothing, the number of buttons, the presence of gold or silver thread, the length of a train on a gown, could be legally prescribed according to one's social standing. And then, of course, there were the shoes. We've touched upon those pointy shoes before, known as crackles or polaines. For a time, particularly in the 14th and 15th centuries, these became an extreme fashion statement with the points, or pikes, extending to absurd lengths. Sumptuary laws frequently targeted these, sometimes dictating the maximum permissible length of the pike based on your rank. A king or high noble might be allowed a very long point, a knight a slightly shorter one, a wealthy merchant shorter still, and a commoner might be restricted to a mere stub or none at all. It's a quirky tidbit that some of these laws got so incredibly specific that they would even dictate the type of material allowed for the lining of a sleeve for a yeoman's wife versus a merchant's daughter. It's hard to imagine the town watchman from our earlier encounter having to whip out a measuring tape to check the legality of someone's footwear. But the laws were on the books. Historians still debate the actual effectiveness of sumptuary laws. Were they rigorously enforced and successful in maintaining social distinctions, or were they frequently flouted, serving more as an expression of elite anxiety about social mobility and changing fashions than as a practical regulatory tool that common people actually adhered to? Given humanity's enduring love for fashion and pushing boundaries, it's likely there was a good deal of quiet rebellion and creative interpretation of the rules. Beyond clothing, public manners and behavior were also under scrutiny. Public drunkenness, for example, was generally frowned upon, not just because it was considered unseemly, but because a drunk person was more likely to cause a disturbance, get into a fight, forget to bank their fire, remember our friend, couvre-feu, the fire-covering curfew, or perhaps try to pay for their next round of ale with a live chicken. Standard Tuesday night, really? While enjoying ale or wine was a normal part of life, excessive intoxication that led to public disorder could certainly land you with a fine or a night in the town's less-than-luxurious lockup. Certain public activities and games were also often regulated or outright prohibited, especially if they involved gambling or took place on Sundays or holy days. Dice games, skittles, or even early forms of football, which was a notoriously violent affair back then, might be banned from public streets or churchyards to prevent disorder, idleness, or behavior deemed inappropriate for sacred times and spaces. Apparently, a rowdy game of knucklebones in the churchyard during Mass was considered a bit off-brand for a holy day of rest. Who knew? The aim was to promote an atmosphere of piety, or at least outward conformity, and to ensure that public spaces remained relatively peaceful and conducive to the town's business and good reputation. Through these laws, both big and small, Oakhaven, like many medieval towns, sought to weave a complex tapestry of social control, ensuring that its citizens not only sounded orderly but also looked and acted the part. Having navigated the rules of appearance and public conduct, your senses now become acutely, perhaps uncomfortably, aware of another fundamental aspect of Oakhaven life that demanded regulation: the very air you breathe and the state of the ground beneath your feet. We've alluded to the unique aromatic profile of a medieval town before, but now, as you delve deeper into the residential and working areas, away from the slightly more presentable main square, you confront the fragrant reality of medieval waste disposal head-on. Let's just say that if Oakhaven had a town motto, "Tread carefully," would be a strong contender. The typical medieval street was less paved with gold, and more paved with whatever fell off the back of a cart, mixed with a generous helping of "don't ask." It's a wonder those pointy shoes we talked about didn't get irretrievably stuck more often. The challenges of sanitation in a densely populated medieval town were immense. With no organized municipal waste collection as we know it, and limited understanding of hygiene by modern standards, getting rid of household and trade refuse was a constant and often rather public affair. The primary method of waste disposal for many households often seemed to be out the window and hope for the best, or perhaps let the pigs deal with it. Remember our porcine friends from earlier, the wandering, self-propelled garbage disposal units? They, along with stray dogs and flocks of opportunistic birds, played a significant, if unofficial, role in processing some of the organic waste. But they were selective eaters, and certainly weren't interested in broken pottery, old rags, or the less appetizing forms of detritus. This meant that streets and alleyways frequently accumulated an astonishing variety of muck, from kitchen scraps and animal dung to human effluent tossed from chamber pots, often with a cursory shout of "garde à l'eau," from the French "prenez garde à l'eau," meaning watch out for the water, if you were lucky. Now, it wasn't complete anarchy. Town authorities were not entirely oblivious to the problems caused by festering piles of rubbish and overflowing cesspits. They did pass laws, often quite detailed ones, attempting to manage the mess. Many towns, Oakhaven likely included, would have bylaws requiring householders to keep the area directly in front of their own property clean, or at least to contribute to its occasional sweeping. There might be designated dumping spots, known as middens, often located just outside the town walls or on less desirable patches of common land, where refuse was supposed to be taken. Of course, getting everyone to trudge their household waste all the way to the official midden, especially when a convenient gutter or patch of wasteland was closer, was an ongoing challenge. Fines were levied for illegal dumping, but enforcement relied heavily on vigilant neighbors, or the occasional patrol by a town official who wasn't afraid to get his boots dirty. Human waste was a particular challenge. While some wealthier households might have had indoor privies, often built as overhanging garderobes that emptied directly into a river or a cesspit below, many relied on simple chamber pots or communal latrines. The construction and maintenance of public privies became a concern for some town councils, and you might find regulations about their cleanliness, or more likely their lack thereof, and how often cesspits needed to be emptied. This rather unpleasant task fell to individuals known as gong fermours or nightmen, who, as their latter name suggests, were usually required to perform their fragrant duties only under the cover of darkness, to minimize public offense. It's a quirky tidbit that these gong fermours, despite the vital service they provided, were often socially marginalized, and their work, while sometimes well-paid due to its undesirability, was considered deeply unpleasant and unclean. Certain trades were notorious for the waste they produced. Butchers, for instance, dealing with animal slaughter, blood, and offal, were often subject to strict rules about where they could conduct their business and how they had to dispose of the considerable and highly perishable byproducts. Many towns required butchers to operate near a flowing river, preferably downstream from where drinking water was drawn, or even to move their slaughtering operations outside the town walls entirely. Tanneries, with their use of noxious chemicals and animal hides, were another major source of pollution and foul smells, and similarly faced regulations attempting to isolate them from residential areas. Town councils did try. They really did. They'd pass a law saying thou shalt not empty thy chamber pot directly onto the mayor's head, or something to that effect, or more realistically, no butcher shall cast blood into the high street. But getting everyone to comply was a different story. It was an uphill battle against an ever-growing mountain of, well, history. Historians still debate the general level of awareness medieval people had regarding the link between filth and disease. While some argue for a nascent understanding evident in certain sanitation laws, others suggest that such regulations were driven more by aesthetic concerns, the immediate nuisance of stench and obstruction, or a desire to avoid divine displeasure believed to be caused by uncleanliness, rather than a clear germ theory. Regardless of the primary motivation, the surviving bylaws show a clear and persistent effort to bring some measure of control to the often overwhelming tide of medieval urban grime. Beyond the tangible refuse that Oak Haven's authorities tried, with varying degrees of success, to sweep from its streets and alleyways, there was also the intangible refuse of ill will, petty discord, and social disruption that they sought to manage. In a close-knit community where reputation was paramount and privacy was a scarce commodity, words could indeed wound, and minor transgressions against public harmony were taken surprisingly seriously. The town's bylaws didn't just concern themselves with runaway pigs or underweight loaves of bread. They also delved into the messy realm of human relationships and public decorum, often relying on methods of punishment that were as public as the offenses themselves. If Oak Haven aimed for a certain olfactory standard, it also aimed for a standard of social civility, enforced through the rather direct means of public shaming. In a medieval town like ours, where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least, fervently believed they did, a sharp tongue or a penchant for spreading malicious gossip could be more damaging than a poorly aimed snowball. Reputation was everything. It affected your trade, your credit, your standing in the community. Slander, making false statements that harmed someone's good name, was therefore often treated as a punishable offense by town courts. If you were found guilty of unjustly besmirching your neighbor's character, perhaps accusing them of shortchanging customers or, heaven forbid, watering down their ale, remember those strict market laws? You might find yourself facing a very public form of penance. The goal wasn't just to punish you, but to publicly reaffirm the value of truthfulness and a good name within the community. The most visible instruments of this public shaming were the stocks and the pillory, likely situated in the most prominent part of town, perhaps the market square or near the town hall, where the maximum number of people could witness the proceedings. The stocks were a simple but effective wooden contraption that secured an offender's ankles, forcing them to sit, often uncomfortably, for a set period. The pillory was a more upright device, securing the head and hands, leaving the unfortunate individual standing, exposed and vulnerable. Being confined in either was essentially an invitation for the entire town to express its disapproval. It was like an involuntary starring role in a very messy, very public interactive theater. though the projectiles were usually limited to rotten vegetables or perhaps some of the less savory street muck we encountered earlier, rather than anything truly harmful usually. The duration of the punishment would vary according to the offense, but even a few hours in the stocks or pillory, enduring the jeers, insults, and perhaps the well-aimed cabbage core from passers-by, would have been a deeply humiliating experience. These weren't the only tools in the public shaming arsenal. For individuals deemed common scolds, typically women who were accused of persistent nagging, arguing, or public quarreling, there was the cucking stool or ducking stool. This was a chair affixed to a long pole, which could be used to lower the offender into a river or pond. It was the medieval equivalent of being told to cool off, only much, much wetter and considerably more perilous, especially in colder weather. Dishonest tradespeople, too, particularly bakers who sold underweight bread or brewers who sold bad ale, might find themselves paraded through the streets with their offending goods tied around their necks before being placed in the pillory. The shame was amplified by the direct connection to their failed professional duty. It's a quirky tidbit that some towns had very specific local customs or even designated days for these punishments. You might find bylaws that allowed for rough music, a shaming ritual where the community would gather outside an offender's house at night, banging pots, pans, and anything else that would make a racket, to signal collective disapproval of behavior like adultery or wife-beating, a sort of noisy, public intervention. Historians still debate the degree to which these public shaming punishments were effective deterrents versus being primarily rituals of community cohesion, allowing townsfolk to collectively reaffirm moral boundaries by scapegoating and temporarily ostracizing minor offenders. Did seeing Thomas the baker in the pillory for a light loaf truly stop other bakers from chancing their arm? Or was it more about everyone else feeling a bit smug and morally superior for an afternoon? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What is clear is that these practices underscored the intensely communal nature of medieval town life, where your actions were very much the business of your neighbors, and where justice for these everyday offenses was not a private affair conducted behind closed doors, but a very visible, very audible, and often very uncomfortable public spectacle. While Oakhaven's authorities, as you've seen, were quite resourceful in managing the daily churn of minor misdeeds, from unruly animals to underweight bread, from noisy neighbors to fashion faux pas, largely through bylaws, fines, and the persuasive power of public embarrassment in the stocks or pillory, you might begin to ponder what happened when a crime occurred that was a bit more substantial. What if the offense was something that couldn't simply be laughed off after a day in the stocks, or settled with a few shillings paid into the town coffers? The truth is, the judicial power of most medieval town courts, like the one likely presided over by Oakhaven's mayor or bailiffs, had its limits, often clearly defined in that very charter we imagined back in Section 1. For the really serious stuff, justice operated on a different, and usually far more formidable, level. The town council might be all over your unregulated geese or that argument you had with a merchant over the price of slightly bruised apples. But if you, say, committed arson that burned down half a street, engaged in outright treason against the crown, or were caught in the act of murder, that was generally considered above their pay grade. These major crimes, often termed felonies, which historically meant offenses so grave they could result in the forfeiture of lands and goods, and often life or limb, typically fell under the jurisdiction of higher authorities. Most commonly, this meant the royal courts. The king's justice, often administered by itinerant judges who traveled the country in circuits, holding courts known as assizes, was a powerful force. When these royal justices rolled into a region, it was a bit like a major audit and a very serious court drama all rolled into one. Suddenly, everyone remembered to be on their absolute best behavior, lest they end up as an example in the don't do this part of the legal proceedings. So, if someone in Oakhaven were accused of a serious felony like grand larceny, theft of goods above a certain value as opposed to petty theft, counterfeiting coins, or homicide, the town authorities would usually be responsible for apprehending the suspect and holding them, perhaps in a more secure town jail than the simple lockup used for minor offenders. But the trial itself and the sentencing would often have to wait for the arrival of the king's justices, or the case might be transferred to a higher county court. The punishments meted out by these royal courts for felonies were, as you can imagine, significantly more severe than a fine or a stint in the pillory. We don't need to dwell on the grim details for our sleepy journey, but suffice it to say, they were designed to be a stark deterrent. There was another layer to this legal tapestry too. the ecclesiastical courts run by the church. These courts had jurisdiction over matters considered spiritual or moral, such as heresy, blasphemy, which we'll touch on later, adultery, disputes over wills and testaments, and offenses committed by clergy members. This leads us to a rather quirky and sometimes life-saving legal loophole known as the benefit of clergy. In medieval England and parts of Europe, if a person accused of a felony could prove they were a member of the clergy, which often simply meant demonstrating an ability to read a passage from the Latin Bible, usually Psalm 51, famously known as the neck verse because it could literally save your neck, they could claim the right to be tried in an ecclesiastical court instead of a secular one. Church courts generally did not impose the death penalty. So, for a first-time offender, successfully claiming benefit of clergy could mean the difference between a harsh penance or imprisonment and a trip to the gallows. Being able to read a bit of Latin could literally save your neck. It was the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free, or at least get-out-of-a-secular-jail-free card for those in holy orders, or those who were literate enough and quick-witted enough to convincingly fake it for a verse or two when their life was on the line. Historians still debate the exact interplay and occasional jurisdictional conflicts between these various courts: the town courts with their bylaws, the manorial courts if a lord still held sway, the powerful ecclesiastical courts, and the ever-expanding royal justice system. It was a complex legal landscape, and how an ordinary person, or even a town official, navigated these overlapping authorities could be a tricky business. For the average citizen of Oakhaven, most of their encounters with the law would likely be with their own town's regulations and officials. But the shadow of higher, more formidable justice always loomed in the background, a reminder that while the town might govern its daily affairs with a certain degree of autonomy, it was still part of a larger kingdom, subject to laws and powers that extended far beyond its stone walls and bustling marketplace. The stocks were one thing, the king's justice was quite another. While the king's justice, as we've just imagined, might deal with the grave aftermath of a deliberately set fire, the good people of Oakhaven, and indeed any medieval town, were far more preoccupied with preventing such a catastrophe, or any accidental blaze, from ever taking hold. In a world built predominantly of wood, plaster, and thatch, where open hearths were the primary source of heat and cooking flames flickered in every home and workshop, fire was not just a risk. It was a constant, ambient dread. A stray spark, a moment of carelessness, and an entire street, even a whole town quarter, could be reduced to smoldering ash with terrifying speed. Most houses in Oakhaven looked like they were built with highly flammable, as a key feature on the architectural plans. Thatch roofs, while offering decent insulation, were basically just pre-piled kindling waiting for a stray spark to introduce itself and start a very unwelcome party. This pervasive fear of flames naturally led to some of the most stringent and frequently reiterated town bylaws. We've already encountered the couvre-feu, or cover fire, rule, enforced by the town watchman and his nightly bell. As you'll recall, this required householders to extinguish or safely bank their fires for the night. This wasn't just about getting people to bed on time, as we discussed with the watchman. It was a desperate plea from the town council. Please, for the love of all that is holy and not currently on fire, bank your embers properly before you drift off to sleep. An unattended fire in the dead of night, with everyone asleep, was the stuff of nightmares for town authorities. The penalties for ignoring the couvre-feu, especially if negligence led to an actual fire, could be severe, moving well beyond a simple fine into the territory of serious culpability. Beyond the nightly fire curfew, numerous other preventative measures were enshrined in Oakhaven's local laws. Householders were often required to keep a vessel of water readily available, perhaps a large barrel or bucket, specifically for firefighting purposes. You might even find laws mandating that each house have leather buckets and a ladder easily accessible. Chimneys, where they existed, as many humbler dwellings simply had a hole in the roof for smoke to escape, were subject to regulations regarding their construction and regular cleaning to prevent the buildup of flammable soot and creosote. Town officials, or designated fire wardens, might have the right to inspect hearths and chimneys, issuing warnings or fines if they were deemed unsafe. Certain trades that involved a high fire risk, such as bakers with their large ovens, brewers with their boiling vats, blacksmiths with their forges, or chandlers making candles from tallow, were often heavily regulated. They might be restricted to operating only in specific areas of the town, perhaps downwind or in stone buildings if available, or even outside the main residential core. There could be rules about storing flammable materials like hay, straw, or firewood, prohibiting large stockpiles within densely packed areas or too close to open flames. It's a quirky tidbit that some towns even had rules about how new thatch had to be applied, or how often it needed to be inspected or replaced, and there might even be specific regulations on the use of lanterns and torches in the streets after dark, lest a carelessly wielded flame ignite an overhanging eave or a pile of refuse. Despite all these precautions, fires still happened. And when they did, the response was a communal one, born of shared terror and necessity. Medieval firefighting techniques were enthusiastic. The main strategy often involved a lot of shouting, some frantic bucket passing from the nearest well or river to the blaze, and trying to pull bits of the burning building away before it set fire to the next highly flammable building. For this purpose, towns often kept specialized equipment, crude though it might seem to us. This included long poles with iron hooks on the end, known as fire hooks. These were used to rip burning thatch from roofs or even to pull down entire sections of blazing timber-framed houses to create a firebreak and stop the conflagration from spreading. It was a desperate, destructive, but sometimes effective measure. All able-bodied men would typically be required by law to assist in firefighting efforts when the alarm was raised, often by the frantic ringing of the church bells or the sounding of a horn by the watch. Historians still debate how effective these early fire prevention measures and firefighting techniques actually were in significantly reducing the frequency or severity of urban conflagrations, especially given the limited technology and often chaotic, panic-driven response once a fire truly took hold. What is undeniable is that the fear of fire shaped the physical layout of towns, the materials used in construction with a slow, expensive shift towards stone and tile where possible, and a significant portion of their legal codes, all in a relentless effort to keep the ever-present threat of destructive flames at bay. Having considered the internal anxieties, like the ever-present fear of fire, that kept Oak Haven citizens and its lawmakers perpetually on edge, you now turn your attention to how the town viewed and managed those who came from outside its familiar stone walls, or indeed, those individuals already within who didn't quite fit the established productive mold. A medieval town, for all its bustling commerce and seeming openness during market days, was at its core a defined community, jealous of its privileges and often wary of the unknown. Arriving in a new medieval town as a stranger was a bit like turning up to a very exclusive, slightly paranoid party uninvited. Everyone wants to know who you are, what you're doing there, and if you're going to steal the metaphorical silver spoons, or, let's be honest, the actual silver spoons if you got half a chance. Remember when you first approached Oak Haven's gates back in the beginning of our journey? The scrutiny you might have faced, even as a harmless, sleepy observer, was a very real part of the medieval travel experience. Town gates weren't just for defense against invading armies. They were checkpoints. Gatekeepers, often members of the town watch we met earlier, had the responsibility of questioning newcomers. Who were you? Where did you come from? What was your business in Oak Haven? How long did you intend to stay? Did you have any means of supporting yourself? These weren't just idle pleasantries. They were an initial screening process. Legitimate merchants with goods to trade, pilgrims on their way to a known shrine, or craftsmen with demonstrable skills might be welcomed, or at least tolerated, as they contributed to the town's economy or spiritual life. However, even they might be required to register, pay a small toll, or find a local citizen to vouch for them if their stay was to be extended. Medieval towns had a complicated relationship with outsiders. They needed merchants for trade and pilgrims for, well, pilgrim-related business and the associated spending, but everyone else was often viewed with the kind of cautious optimism you might reserve for a surprise visit from your most unpredictable and potentially disruptive in-laws. The real concern, and the target of many stringent bylaws, was the figure of the vagrant or the sturdy beggar, individuals perceived as able-bodied but unwilling to work, wandering from place to place without a clear purpose or visible means of support. In an era with no social safety net beyond the local parish or guild charity, which was usually reserved for their own, and where labor was often in demand, such rootless individuals were viewed with deep suspicion. They were seen as a potential drain on resources, a threat to public order, and possible carriers of disease, a particularly potent fear in times of plague. Laws against vagrancy were common and often harsh. Those deemed vagrants could face whipping, branding, being put in the stocks, much like our local miscreants, or simply being forcibly expelled from the town, sometimes escorted to the boundary by a rather unceremonious town official. The official medieval town policy on people hanging around without an obvious job seemed to be, look busy, have a very good story, or learn to enjoy the scenic route out of town, possibly at a brisk, officially encouraged pace. It's a quirky tidbit that many towns made legal distinctions between the worthy poor and these unworthy vagrants. The worthy poor were generally considered to be the town's own residents who had fallen on hard times through no fault of their own, local widows, orphans, the elderly, the chronically ill, or disabled. For these individuals, there might be some level of local charitable support, often administered by the church or religious guilds. But able-bodied beggars from outside the town, or those within who were simply deemed idle, received far less sympathy and much more suspicion. Some towns even established hospitals, not in the modern medical sense, but as places of hospitality offering temporary shelter and food, primarily for genuine pilgrims or very needy, legitimate travelers. However, even these institutions often had strict rules about the length of stay and the conduct expected of their guests, ensuring they didn't become permanent refuges for those avoiding work. Historians still debate the extent to which laws against vagrancy and the general suspicion of outsiders were driven by genuine concerns about crime rates and the very real scarcity of resources in often overcrowded towns, versus reflecting a deeper-seated social anxiety about rootlessness, a desire to maintain a clearly defined and controllable community, and perhaps even a fear of ideas or influences that might challenge the established order. In a society built on fixed hierarchies and known allegiances, the unattached, masterless individual was an anomaly, a loose thread in the social fabric, and medieval town bylaws often reflected a strong desire to either weave that thread back in or snip it off and cast it out. The welcome in Oakhaven, it seems, was conditional and heavily dependent on whether you were seen as a useful addition or a potential problem. Beyond the town's concern for who was coming and going, or who was toiling away at a productive craft versus who was deemed an idle vagrant, lay another profound layer of regulation, one that touched nearly every aspect of life in Oakhaven: the pervasive influence of the church and the laws designed to uphold its teachings and ensure public piety. The church in medieval times was less like a quiet Sunday morning service you might pop into occasionally and more like the ultimate lifestyle brand, with its own comprehensive legal department, extensive real estate holdings, a significant say in education and welfare, and a very influential voice in pretty much everything, including the drafting and enforcement of Oakhaven's local bylaws. Its moral authority was deeply interwoven with the secular power of the town council, creating a powerful combination for shaping public behavior. Perhaps the most visible manifestation of the church's sway over daily routines was the rigorous enforcement of Sunday observance. This wasn't just a gentle suggestion to take a day off. It was, in many respects, the law of the land, backed by both ecclesiastical decree and town ordinance. On Sundays, and often on other significant holy days and saints' days, most forms of work were strictly prohibited. The bustling marketplace you explored earlier would likely be deserted, or at least officially closed, its stalls empty and silent. The craftsman's hammer, the weaver's shuttle, the farmer's plow, all were expected to rest. Working on a Sunday in Oakhaven wasn't just frowned upon. It was like publicly declaring you found God's mandated day of rest a bit inefficient. The local priest and the town council would have a quiet word, possibly involving a fine or some form of public penance if you were a repeat offender. The primary activity expected of good Christian folk was, of course, attendance at Massachusetts. The church bells would ring out, calling the community to worship, and failing to attend without a very good reason could also draw unwelcome attention. Naturally, life couldn't grind to a complete halt. It's a quirky tidbit that you'd often find very specific, and sometimes rather convoluted, exceptions or allowances in these Sunday laws. A baker, for instance, whose work was vital, might be permitted by local custom or bylaw to light his ovens late on a Sunday afternoon or evening, so that fresh bread would be available on Monday morning, but he certainly wouldn't be allowed to openly sell his wares on the Lord's Day itself. Innkeepers might be allowed to provide food and lodging for genuine travelers, but the serving of ale for general revelry or to locals might be restricted until after the main church services were concluded. And then there were church alesh, which were fascinating community fundraising events. The parish would brew a batch of ale, sell it, and the profits would go towards the upkeep of the church or to help the local poor. These often involved feasting, games, and merriment, and could sometimes take place on a Sunday afternoon, creating a sort of sanctioned, communal bending of the stricter rules about Sabbath solemnity. Beyond ensuring bums on pews and a day off from hammering and hawking, the church, supported by town law, was also deeply concerned with policing public morality, particularly when it came to speech. Blasphemy, defined broadly as any speech, writing, or action considered contemptuous, disrespectful, or reviling towards God, Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, the saints, or sacred objects and doctrines, was a very serious offense. Using choice words about the Almighty or, say, questioning the structural integrity of Noah's Ark a little too loudly in the marketplace could land you in hot water. This wasn't just about hurt feelings. Blasphemy was seen as an insult to God that could potentially bring divine wrath down upon the entire community. Nobody wanted to be responsible for the next plague or crop failure because Thomas the Tanner couldn't control his tongue after a few too many. Punishments could range from fines and public apologies to humiliating public penances like being forced to stand in the church porch wearing a sign detailing your offense, or even corporal punishment for persistent blasphemers, though the most extreme measures were usually handled by ecclesiastical courts. The line between lively theological debate amongst learned scholars and "you're going to need a bigger apology" blasphemy for the common person was often thinner than a poorly made communion wafer. More extreme deviations from accepted religious doctrine, such as outright heresy, would almost certainly escalate beyond the capabilities of Oakhaven's town council, falling squarely into the jurisdiction of the church's own formidable legal machinery, like the bishop's court or, in some places and times, the Inquisition. But for the everyday enforcement of religious decorum and moral standards, the town authorities and the local clergy worked hand in glove. Historians still debate the extent to which the lay population genuinely embraced these enforced religious observances out of deep personal piety, versus complying due to social pressure, fear of punishment, or simply the lack of alternative activities on mandated holy days. Regardless, the rhythmic tolling of church bells, the enforced quiet of a Sunday, and the ever-present threat of censure for moral or verbal transgressions were constant reminders to everyone in Oakhaven that their lives were lived not just under the eye of their neighbors and the town bailiff, but also, very profoundly, under the watchful gaze of God and His Church. Having contemplated the spiritual regulations and the enforcement of moral decorum that so profoundly shaped life in Oakhaven, your thoughts now drift towards something far more elemental, yet equally crucial for the town's daily survival and communal harmony: the life-giving and often fiercely contested resource of water. In an era before convenient pipes delivered treated water directly into every home, securing enough clean water for drinking, cooking, washing, and for various essential trades was a constant preoccupation, and, as you might expect, a subject of numerous town bylaws. The concept of tap water in Oakhaven was still several centuries and a whole lot of sophisticated plumbing away. Well water, river water, or perhaps conduit water, if the town was particularly advanced, was the order of the day, and its quality could range from surprisingly refreshing to has bits in it and tastes faintly of old socks. Most towns like Oakhaven would rely on a combination of sources. Public wells, laboriously dug and often lined with stone, would be vital community hubs. You can imagine them, perhaps with a simple windlass or just a bucket on a rope, surrounded by townsfolk patiently waiting their turn, exchanging news and gossip as they filled their pails and pitchers. Larger, more prosperous towns sometimes invested in elaborate conduit systems, networks of wooden or lead pipes that brought water from a spring or a clean river source outside the town into public fountains or cisterns located in central squares. These fountains could become points of civic pride, sometimes ornately decorated, a visible symbol of the town's ability to provide for its citizens. And then, of course, there was the river that likely flowed through or near Oakhaven, a convenient and abundant source, but also, as we touched upon when discussing sanitation, a convenient dumping ground for all manner of waste. This dual role of rivers as both water source and de facto sewer created an immediate and obvious tension, which town bylaws attempted to navigate. You would commonly find regulations strictly prohibiting the washing of particularly dirty items, like soiled laundry or animal hides, directly upstream from where drinking water was drawn. Similarly, trades known for their polluting effluent. Remember our friends the butchers and tanners from Section 8, who often discharged blood, awful and noxious chemicals, would often be mandated by law to operate well downstream of the town's main water intakes, or even outside the walls altogether. Certain trades, like tanners and dyers, were the bad boys of medieval water usage, essential for the economy, but everyone wished they'd set up shop about 5 miles downstream, and downwind, preferably on another planet. The aim was to protect the quality of the drinking water, at least in theory, though enforcement could be patchy, and the definition of clean was undoubtedly more flexible than ours. It wasn't just pollution that laws addressed. It was also about fair access and responsible use. Water was a finite resource, especially in times of drought. Bylaws might dictate when and how much water individuals or specific trades could draw. Brewers, for example, needed vast quantities of water, as did dyers. Their activities might be restricted during dry spells to ensure enough remained for essential domestic needs. There could be rules against diverting streams or damming watercourses in a way that disadvantaged downstream users, whether they were other townsfolk or mills that relied on water power. Arguments over water access could get surprisingly heated. Accusing someone of damming the stream that fed your small garden, or of letting their particularly unhygienic ducks, or those noisy geese we met earlier swim and foul the water just upstream of the town's drinking supply, was grounds for some serious medieval side-eye and possibly a hefty bylaw citation. To oversee these precious resources, some towns appointed specific officials. You might have a conduit warden responsible for maintaining the pipes and fountains of a conduit system, or a well reeve who supervised the upkeep of public wells and enforced the rules about their use. It's a quirky tidbit that some of these public fountains or wells had quite elaborate structures built over them, and there could be very specific, almost ritualistic, rules about their cleaning and maintenance, sometimes involving annual ceremonies. There might also be laws against allowing children to play too boisterously around wells, lest they fall in or contaminate the water, or prohibitions on watering livestock directly at a source intended for human consumption. Historians still debate how effective municipal attempts to provide and protect clean water supplies truly were, and to what extent the general populace understood the dangers of contaminated water, beyond a basic aversion to obviously fouled or ill-smelling sources. While the full germ theory of disease was centuries away, there seems to have been at least an empirical understanding that cleaner water was better, and the multitude of bylaws reflect a persistent civic effort to secure this vital necessity for the people of Oakhaven, even if it meant a constant struggle against pollution, overuse, and the occasional misbehaving goose. Having considered the vital flow of water through Oakhaven, and the regulations that attempted to keep it clean and fairly distributed, your gaze now lifts from the ground and the waterways to the very structures that define its crowded, jostling landscape, the houses, shops, and workshops themselves. You begin to notice, if you haven't already been thoroughly immersed in it, the rather wonderfully haphazard way the town seems to have been put together. The streets, far from being straight and orderly, often wind and twist like shy serpents, and the buildings lean in towards each other as if sharing ancient secrets. This distinctive, somewhat crooked construction style wasn't usually a result of poor craftsmanship, though that could play a part, but rather a product of organic growth, the pressing need to maximize space, and a set of building regulations that were, shall we say, often interpreted with a generous degree of medieval flexibility. One of the most striking features you'll observe is the jettying of upper floors. This is where each subsequent story of a timber-framed building projects out slightly further than the one below it. Those overhanging upper stories, or jetties, were a clever medieval way to get a bit more square footage upstairs, valuable living or storage space, without paying extra ground rent, as property was often taxed based on its footprint at street level. It also had the side effect of creating more sheltered walkways below, which was handy in rainy weather, though it also meant the streets could be rather gloomy. And, of course, it meant you could practically shake hands with your neighbor across the very narrow street, or, more likely, as we've touched upon when discussing sanitation, it perhaps made it easier to empty certain household receptacles with even less chance of inconveniencing your own doorstep. This practice, while ingenious from an individual homeowner's perspective, inevitably led to progressively narrower gaps between buildings as they rose, sometimes making the sky a mere sliver visible from below. Naturally, town authorities had opinions on such matters. Bylaws often attempted to regulate just how far these jetties could encroach over the public thoroughfare. There had to be enough room for a loaded cart to pass, or at least a reasonably well-fed donkey. Though some medieval streets were so narrow, Two such donkeys probably couldn't pass each other without a lengthy negotiation, some bruised panniers, and possibly the intervention of a hypothetical donkey traffic warden. Spoiler: that esteemed official probably didn't exist. The concern wasn't just about passage, but also about light and air, which were already in short supply in the denser parts of town. So, while jetties were common, there were usually limits, however poorly enforced they might have been. Oak Haven's building code, if it were formally written down in one place, probably had a core principle something like, try not to let your new extension actually touch the building opposite, and for everyone's sake, try not to let it fall over immediately. And if it does, aim away from anyone important. Fire safety, as we know from Section 11, was a bonus consideration, with timber frames being a constant worry. Property lines were another source of endless contention and, consequently, regulation. In a town where space was at a premium, every inch mattered. Disputes between neighbors over the exact placement of a wall, a fence, a drainage ditch, or even an outhouse were commonplace. You might find town bylaws specifying procedures for settling such disagreements, sometimes involving officials known as viewers or surveyors. It's a quirky tidbit that these viewers might be called upon to make a judgment based on ancient custom, local memory, or even by physically walking the bounds. There might also be peculiar local rules about things like ancient lights. The right of a property to continue receiving daylight, meaning your neighbor couldn't just build a massive extension that plunged your workshop into perpetual twilight without some form of legal recourse, or at least a very heated argument. Similarly, shop stalls and merchants' displays often spilled out from the shop fronts onto the street, and bylaws would attempt to define just how far these temporary encroachments could extend, perhaps measured by the length of a standard market board, or the reach of a man's arm holding an axe, or some other wonderfully specific but hard to standardize local measure. Historians still debate whether the seemingly chaotic, higgledy-piggledy layout of many medieval towns was primarily a result of a lack of centralized planning and consistently weak enforcement of building regulations, or if it, in fact, reflected a practical, adaptable, and organic approach to urban growth that prioritized individual needs and efficient land use within the confined, often walled, spaces. Perhaps it was a bit of both. A constant tug-of-war between the individual's desire to maximize their own patch and the community's need for some semblance of order, access, and safety. As you look up at the leaning gables and shadowy overhangs of Oak Haven, you see a skyline shaped not just by wood and plaster, but by centuries of these small, everyday negotiations and the often ignored, sometimes enforced, attempts to bring a little bit of straightness to a wonderfully crooked world. Having marveled at the physical contortions of Oak Haven's architecture, where buildings leaned and jettied with a certain charming disregard for perfect alignment, you now find your thoughts turning to some equally specific, and sometimes rather baffling, temporal regulations. These were rules that governed not just the general end of the day with the sweeping curfew bell, but particular activities at very particular, and occasionally quite odd hours. It wasn't just everyone indoors by 9, as we've established. Oh no, in a town like Oak Haven, the rhythm of life could be punctuated by a whole series of smaller, more targeted time-based ordinances designed to manage the complex, sometimes conflicting, needs of its inhabitants. They like to keep you on your toes, or at least make sure your toes weren't engaged in unauthorized activities at the wrong time. Think about the various trades we've encountered. A blacksmith, for instance, whose work was essential but undeniably noisy, might be permitted to start his hammering at dawn, but could well be required by a local bylaw to cease his clangor by a certain hour in the late afternoon, well before the main curfew, to allow the surrounding households a few hours of relative peace before nightfall. Similarly, butchers, whose work involved, shall we say, less than picturesque processes, might be restricted to slaughtering animals only in the very early morning hours, before the main streets became too crowded, and to allow for the prompt cleanup of their premises and the disposal of waste before it became too offensive in the heat of the day. Millers, too, with their constant need for water power and the rumbling, grinding noise of their machinery, often had their own special timetable. Woe betide the miller who started grinding his corn, thereby diverting precious water or creating a racket, when it was Dame Agnes's legally mandated hour to do her laundry in the stream, or when another part of the town was supposed to have priority for the water flow. That was a level of neighborhood drama nobody needed, and bylaws were there to try and preempt it. These odd-hour ordinances weren't just about noise or resource management, though though those were major factors. They could also be about public order and safety during specific times. For example, during the busiest hours of market day, certain narrow streets might be temporarily closed to heavy cart traffic to prevent gridlock and protect pedestrians. Or there might be rules about when deliveries of bulky goods like timber or stone could be made, restricting them to early morning or late evening to minimize disruption. Some towns even had quirky rules about when certain public amenities could be used. Perhaps the town's main bathhouse, if it had one, had different hours for men and women, or was closed entirely on certain holy days for reasons of propriety. Apprentices, those young learners of trades we met when discussing guilds, often had their own, even earlier, curfews. While the general populace might be expected indoors after the main curfew bell, apprentices, typically young lads living away from home, might be required by guild or town ordinance to be back in their master's house an hour or two sooner. This was partly to ensure they got enough rest for the next day's work, partly to keep them out of mischief, as unsupervised youths are wont to find, and partly because their masters were legally responsible for their conduct. If an apprentice was caught out late, causing trouble, it was the master who might face the fine. One can imagine them, like modern teenagers with a strict curfew, trying to squeeze every last minute of freedom before having to dash home, lest they face the wrath of their master and possibly a bylaw infraction. Apprentices, if left unsupervised after dark, were statistically more likely to engage in shenanigans, try to invent a perpetual motion machine out of spare wagon wheels, or simply forget where their master's house was in the unlit streets. It's a quirky tidbit that some towns had a whole series of bells throughout the day, not just the main curfew. There might be a work bell to signal the official start and end of the working day for certain trades, a market bell to announce the opening and closing of the market, or even a gleaning bell, which would ring after the harvest was complete in the surrounding fields, signaling to the poor of the parish that they were now permitted to enter the fields and gather any leftover grain. Some sources mention a beer bell or ale stake bell in the evening, perhaps an hour before the main curfew, indicating the last call for taverns to serve drinks, giving patrons a fair warning to finish up and head home. Historians still debate whether these highly specific odd-hour ordinances were meticulously planned attempts at micromanaging urban life for maximum efficiency and order, or if they were more often reactive responses to specific local disputes, nuisances that had gotten out of hand, or perhaps even the lobbying efforts of particular interest groups, like a powerful guild wanting to control working hours or ensure their members weren't disturbed by another trade. Whatever their origin, these time-specific rules added yet another layer to the complex regulatory web of medieval Oakhaven, ensuring that not only what you did, but when you did it, was often a matter of public concern and legal prescription. After uncovering layer upon layer of Oakhaven's intricate rules and regulations, from the grand sweep of the nightly curfew that hushed the entire town to the minutiae of when a cooper could hammer his barrels or how long the points on your shoes could be, a crucial question begins to form in your mind. Who exactly was keeping track of all this? And how, in a world without CCTV, instant communication, or a police force in the modern sense, were these myriad laws actually enforced? The answer, like many things in a medieval town, was a complex tapestry woven from official duty, communal expectation, and a healthy dose of neighborly observation. Or, to put it less poetically, a lot of people keeping an eye on everyone else. We've already met some of the official enforcers. There's the town watch, diligently, or perhaps not so diligently, depending on the individual and the weather, patrolling the streets at night, primarily concerned with the curfew, fire prevention, and any overt disturbances. Then you might have beadles or constables, lower-ranking town officials who had a broader range of duties during the daytime. These individuals might be responsible for summoning people to the town court, serving notices, inspecting market stalls for compliance with weights and measures, or even physically apprehending those caught red-handed breaking a bylaw, like trying to sneak an unrung pig past the market gate. The town beadle probably had a mental checklist longer than a royal procession. Geese accounted for? Check. Suspiciously pointy shoes? Check. Anyone looking like they're enjoying themselves too much after 9 p.m.? Or, heaven forbid, working on a Sunday? Double check. Their presence was a visible reminder of the town's authority, though their numbers were usually small, and their ability to be everywhere at once was, naturally, limited. This is where the community itself played a vital role. Enforcement wasn't just a top-down affair. it was also very much bottom-up. In the close-knit, often cheek-by-jowl environment of Oakhaven, your neighbors weren't just there to borrow a cup of, probably very coarse, flour, though sugar was likely too much of a luxury for casual borrowing. They were also your unofficial, unpaid surveillance team, acutely aware of your comings and goings, the state of your front path, the volume of your arguments, and whether your chickens were consistently making a nuisance of themselves in their vegetable patch. Many bylaws relied heavily on citizens reporting infractions they witnessed. If your neighbor was flagrantly violating the Sunday work ban by, say, noisily mending his cart in his front yard, or if another was consistently dumping their household waste in the alleyway instead of taking it to the designated midden, you might be expected, or even feel a civic duty or perhaps a touch of righteous indignation, to report them to the authorities. The town court records that survive from medieval periods are often filled with cases initiated by one citizen bringing a complaint against another for breaches of these local ordinances. Sometimes, this neighborly vigilance was further encouraged by more formal means. It's a quirky tidbit that some towns offered a financial incentive for reporting certain offenses. An individual who successfully informed on someone breaking a bylaw, particularly one that carried a monetary fine, might be legally entitled to a share of that fine upon conviction. These individuals were sometimes known as promoters or common informers. While this system could, in theory, improve compliance by increasing the chances of being caught, it also had the potential to foster a rather unpleasant atmosphere of suspicion and could easily be abused for personal vendettas or malicious gossip. Some people took to reporting their neighbors with a bit too much enthusiasm, perhaps hoping to get a discount on their own slightly too loud goose fine, or simply relishing the minor drama. It was the medieval version of competitive neighborhood watch, where the prize was a slightly less grumpy bailiff paying you a visit, or maybe just the quiet satisfaction of seeing your annoying neighbor get their comeuppance. Historians still debate the balance between formal, top-down enforcement by these few town officials and this informal, bottom-up community policing through neighborly vigilance and social pressure, and which method was ultimately more effective in maintaining order and ensuring compliance with the vast web of medieval town bylaws. Was it the fear of the beadle's staff? Or the fear of Mistress Higgins from next door giving you the stink eye for a week and then quietly mentioning your transgressions to the ward authorities? Perhaps the most potent enforcement came from the combination of both. The knowledge that official sanctions existed, coupled with the ever-present awareness that your actions were being observed and judged by the community around you. In Oakhaven, it seems the walls had ears, the windows had eyes, and even the cobblestones might whisper your minor infractions to the nearest person of authority. Now that you have a rather comprehensive picture of Oakhaven's diligent, and sometimes downright nosy, enforcers, from the official town watchman making his nightly rounds to the eagle-eyed Mistress Higgins next door who seems to miss absolutely nothing, your mind inevitably drifts to the other side of this intricate legal equation. With so many rules governing nearly every conceivable aspect of daily life, from the honking of your geese to the precise timing of your barrel making, surely not everyone was a model of perfect medieval compliance all the time? It's a fundamental human truth, isn't it, that where there are rules, there are also people trying to find a way around them. And the citizens of medieval Oakhaven, for all their presumed piety and community spirit, were, after all, human. Let's be honest, if there's a rule, someone somewhere is immediately trying to figure out how to creatively interpret it. Medieval Oakhaven was no different. Does the couvre-feu really apply? You can almost hear someone muttering, if my fire is just, smoldering enthusiastically rather than actually blazing, consider the bustling marketplace with its regulations on weights, measures, and quality. A baker, facing a rise in the cost of flour but legally bound by the fixed price of a loaf, might be sorely tempted to make his loaves just a fraction underweight, hoping the official weigher is having an off day or is distracted by a particularly juicy bit of town gossip. Or a merchant selling cloth might subtly include a piece with a minor flaw in a large order, banking on the buyer not inspecting every single inch. These weren't acts of outright defiance, perhaps, but small, calculated risks, weighing the potential gain against the chance of being caught and shamed or fined. The surviving court records from medieval towns are often filled with repeat offenders for just these sorts of minor commercial transgressions, suggesting that for some, the occasional fine was simply factored in as a cost of doing business. Then there were the more active and sometimes quite ingenious methods of dodging decrees. If you owned one of those notorious wandering pigs that we discussed, and you really didn't want to pay for the damage it did to your neighbor's prize-winning leeks, You might become adept at feigning complete ignorance when confronted. My pig, Sir Bailiff? Surely not. Bartholomew is a model of porcine decorum and was securely in his sty all afternoon, dreaming of, well, whatever it is that law-abiding pigs dream of. Or, if you were determined to engage in a bit of prohibited work on a Sunday, perhaps finishing a rush order that a wealthy patron simply had to have, you might do so very quietly, behind closed shutters, with a lookout posted for the local beadle or any overly zealous church-going neighbors. If you were particularly bold, and the potential profits particularly high, you might even try a bit of discreet bribery. For particularly inconvenient bylaws, a strategically placed chicken, a small jug of your best ale, or a shiny silver coin might occasionally persuade a minor town official to develop a sudden, temporary case of nearsightedness or an urgent need to be inspecting something on the other side of town. It's amazing how a little bit of goodwill could clarify so many misunderstandings about, say, the exact legal length of a fish for sale, or whether that cart was technically parked in a prohibited zone. Sumptuary laws, those fashion regulations dictating who could wear what, must have been a constant source of creative evasion. If you were a merchant's wife with a secret passion for a particular shade of blue officially reserved for minor nobility, you might wear it discreetly at home or under an outer garment when in public. If you were determined to sport those fashionable, illegally long-pointed shoes, you probably became very good at walking with a slight shuffle when near anyone in authority, or conveniently standing behind barrels or market stalls whenever the town fashion police were on their patrol. Out of sight, out of bylaw trouble, or so the thinking went. Guild members, too, despite their own strict internal rules, weren't always paragons of virtue. It's a quirky tidbit that some craftsmen were known to use slightly inferior materials in hidden parts of their work, or employ shortcuts in their techniques to save time and costs, all while presenting a perfectly compliant facade to the guild searchers. These were the little secrets of the trade, passed down from master to apprentice, part of the unwritten code of getting by. Historians still debate the general level of civic obedience in medieval towns where most people fundamentally law-abiding, with rule-breaking being an ongoing, low-level exception, or was there a more pervasive culture of minor non-compliance and constant negotiation with authority, where many bylaws were viewed more as aspirational guidelines rather than absolute, unbendable dictates. The sheer number of bylaws, and the frequency with which many had to be reissued or amended, suggests a constant cat-and-mouse game between the rule-makers and the rule-benders. Life in Oakhaven clearly involved not just knowing the law, but also knowing how far you could stretch it, when you could look the other way, and who you needed to keep on your good side. It was a dance of compliance and circumvention, a testament to the enduring human spirit of finding a little wiggle room, even in the most regulated of medieval worlds. Having chuckled at the ingenious, and sometimes rather desperate, ways the folk of Oakhaven might have dodged its many decrees, from hiding their overly enthusiastic geese to creatively interpreting the exact meaning of Curfews, you begin to realize that this elaborate, ever-expanding rulebook wasn't carved in stone from the moment the town received its first charter. Like Oakhaven itself, with its slowly shifting street patterns and buildings that rose, were altered, and sometimes fell, its laws were living things. They ebbed and flowed, adapting, or stubbornly resisting adaptation, to the changing tides of medieval life over many centuries. The peculiar ordinances that governed your imagined visit weren't necessarily the same ones that would have governed a visitor 100 years prior, or 100 years hence. The medieval period, after all, wasn't a static, unchanging block of time. It spanned roughly a millennium, and during those centuries, towns like Oakhaven experienced significant transformations. Populations grew, sometimes dramatically, putting pressure on resources like food, water, and housing, and inevitably leading to new social frictions that required legal address. New trades emerged, bringing with them new processes, new materials, new guild rivalries, and, of course, new opportunities for nuisance that bylaws had to try and anticipate or react to. Economic fortunes waxed and waned. A boom in the wool trade, for example, might necessitate a whole raft of new regulations concerning sheep, wool markets, weavers, and dyers. Conversely, a period of economic decline might see some laws become irrelevant, or new ones enacted to try and stimulate trade or control poverty. The Oakhaven Town Council probably had a suggestion box for new bylaws, though it was likely just a damp corner where people threw written complaints and hopeful petitions until someone important, or at least someone tasked with sweeping, tripped over them. Then, perhaps, an item might make it to the council agenda. Hear ye, the pointy shoe law has been amended yet again. Points may now be 2 whole barleycorns longer on alternate Tuesdays, but only if not dyed with that frightfully expensive foreign indigo. Major events, too, left their indelible mark on town law. The Black Death in the mid-14th century, for instance, had a profound impact. With populations decimated, labor became scarce and therefore more valuable. This led to attempts by national and local authorities to control wages and the movement of laborers, the Statute of Laborers in England being a prime example. And these overarching laws would have influenced local town ordinances as well. Public health, or at least a rudimentary understanding of contagion, also came more sharply into focus, potentially leading to stricter, if still largely ineffective by modern standards, sanitation laws or rules about dealing with the sick and the dead. Wars could bring new taxes, new defense requirements, and new anxieties about strangers, all reflected in the town's legal code. The process of making and changing these laws typically rested with the town's governing body, perhaps a mayor and a council of aldermen or prominent burghers. They would meet, debate, one imagines with varying degrees of civility and efficiency, and enact new ordinances or amend existing ones. Sometimes the impetus for change came from royal decrees or new parliamentary statutes that towns were obliged to incorporate into their local legal framework. Other times it was pressure from powerful local guilds, seeking to protect their monopolies or enforce new standards. And, of course, as we've seen, sometimes a new bylaw was simply a reaction to a persistent local problem that had finally become too annoying or too dangerous to ignore any longer. Perhaps one too many carts had gotten stuck in that particularly narrow part of High Street, or a new, alarmingly popular but disruptive tavern game needed to be addressed. It's a quirky tidbit that sometimes old laws that were no longer relevant or practically enforceable weren't formally repealed or struck from the record books. They simply fell into disuse, becoming dead-letter laws. Imagine in the year 1450, a newly appointed Oakhaven town clerk, diligently dusting off the ancient vellum roll containing the town's ordinances, and stumbling upon a fiercely worded bylaw from 1150 about the correct and non-threatening way for a visiting Norman knight to approach a griffin statue in the market square without causing undue alarm to the local poultry. It would probably cause a bit of head-scratching and a quiet decision to just leave that one be, nestled amongst the more current concerns about pig parking and ale prices. Historians still debate the primary drivers of this legal evolution in medieval towns. Was it predominantly a top-down process led by elite councils and heavily influenced by the development of royal justice and common law? Or did pressures from ordinary townsfolk, the collective bargaining of guilds, and shifting local customs and expectations play a more significant, grassroots role in shaping new bylaws and letting old ones fade away? Legal evolution in medieval times was a bit like a very slow software update. It took ages, was often implemented patchily, sometimes made things worse before they got better, and occasionally you still had to deal with legacy bugs from 3 centuries prior, like that half-forgotten rule about not whistling after dark near the old town well, just in case it disturbed the well, whatever it was they thought it might disturb back then. The laws of Oakhaven were a testament to its history, a layered parchment of past anxieties, solutions, and the enduring human attempt to make sense of living together in close quarters. As your imaginary sojourn through Oakhaven's ever-shifting statutes and ancient bylaws draws towards its close, you find the light beginning to fade once more across the higgledy-piggledy rooftops and narrow, winding streets. The day, much like the long medieval era itself with all its peculiar charms and stringent rules, is surrendering to the soft embrace of twilight. And with that dimming light comes that familiar, resonant sound, the one that first heralded your deeper immersion into this regulated world, the deep, clangorous toll of the curfew bell. There it is again, punctual as ever, Oakhaven's official signal that it's time to stop whatever mildly illicit fun you might have been observing people have, and for everyone to pretend to be a model, law-abiding citizen until sunrise. Or at least until the watchman is well and truly out of earshot and sight. You've walked these streets, in your mind's eye, observing the attempts to control everything from the honking of geese to the architectural ambitions of its citizens, from the whispers of gossip to the very prayers on their lips. You've seen how laws govern the marketplace, the hearth, the public square, and even the silent, watchful hours of the night. Living in Oakhaven, you reflect, would mean memorizing a mental rulebook thicker than a Christmas fruitcake, and probably just as dense in places. But hey, at least you'd always know where you stood most likely, right next to someone who might be quietly considering whether your tunic was a permissible shade of brown for your station, or if your pig looked a tad too gleeful digging near the public well. You find yourself almost going to miss the constant, gentle undercurrent of potential for being fined for having an opinionated goose or shoes that are just a little too fashion-forward for your alleged social standing. It certainly would have kept life interesting, if a little perilous for one's purse and public reputation. The nightly curfew, you realize, was perhaps one of the most enduring and consistently enforced aspects of medieval urban life, a powerful symbol repeated across centuries. It represented the community's collective desire to impose order over the inherent uncertainties and potential dangers of the night. With each toll of the bell, the public day officially ended. Fires were banked even more carefully than usual, and the town gates, those heavy wooden sentinels, were barred and bolted, sealing Oakhaven off from the world outside, and perhaps sealing its inhabitants in with their own specific brand of regulated peace. It's a quirky tidbit that on the very last, reverberating toll of that curfew bell, some town watchmen, in some places, were known to cry out a specific, brief prayer or a traditional phrase, something akin to "God save the King and this good town of Oakhaven, and may all within sleep soundly and wake safely." A sort of final, vocal seal on the day, a last official whisper before the deeper silence of the late night truly took hold. As you listen to those fading chimes, you ponder the very nature of this medieval community. Historians still debate whether the overwhelming sense of community and social cohesion often attributed to medieval towns, with their guilds, parishes, and shared civic life, was a genuine outcome of mutual reliance and deeply felt belonging, or perhaps a more idealized image that sometimes masks underlying tensions, inequalities, and the inherently coercive nature of such pervasive, inescapable regulation. Was Oakhaven a cozy haven of order, or a slightly claustrophobic fishbowl where every ripple was noted and judged? Perhaps, like most human endeavors, it was a complex, contradictory mix of both. But for now, the arguments and the activities of the day are done. The sounds of hammering, of market cries, of children playing, even of those determined geese, are all quieting down, subdued by the ancient rhythm of the curfew. The windows are shuttered, a soft glow perhaps still visible through a few cracks, but the streets are emptying. The town is preparing to rest, to submit once more to the oldest law of all, the need for sleep. And as Oakhaven settles under the cloak of approaching night, it's time for you, too, to let these images of bustling, rule-bound streets begin to soften and fade from your mind. Allow the lingering echoes of the curfew bell to become a gentle, rhythmic hum, a soothing sound that rocks you slowly towards your own peaceful rest. The concerns of medieval lawmakers, the anxieties about wandering pigs, and the precise length of shoe points can now drift away like smoke from a carefully banked hearth. There are no more bylaws to consider, no more decrees to dodge, no vigilant neighbors to worry about in this moment. Only the quiet comfort of your own bed, the gentle rise and fall of your own breath. Let the narrow, shadowy streets of Oakhaven recede into the mists of imagination, their crooked charm dissolving into the soft darkness behind your eyelids. Feel any remaining tension about following the rules or understanding their peculiar logic simply melt away, leaving only a sense of calm and the pleasant weariness that comes after a long, intriguing journey. The medieval world, with all its clamor and its quiet, its order and its charming chaos, is now far, far away. You are here, safe and still, drifting on a peaceful tide. Let the last vestiges of thought become as light and indistinct as an old, forgotten statute, no longer needing enforcement, no longer needing your attention. Just peace now, just quiet, just the gentle, easy drift into deep, untroubled sleep.